Hello and welcome to the DTP podcast, the go-to podcast for everything concerning social housing, from regulation and compliance to finance and treasury management. I'm Stuart, and in today's episode, we're looking at the new inspections regime, which came into effect this April. We're joined by DTP Director Angela Lomax, who has been working with social housing providers preparing for inspection. Angela, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you, Stuart. It's great to be here and to discuss these important changes.
So first of all, let's get the basics right. Am I right to think that IDAs have been replaced by inspections under the new regime?
That's correct. Inspections were part of the big regulatory changes that were effective from the 1st of April this year, 2024. And at the time of recording, the Q1 inspections are coming to a close and Q2 inspections are now being notified. So, yeah, definitely fully into the inspection regime now.
So how do they differ?
So there is some difference in terms of the process, but essentially, a regulator is looking for assurance in relation to governance, financial viability, and consumer regulation. That's essentially the new element. It's important to say they're equally weighted. So I think there's been perhaps some thinking that in the new regime, consumer regulation would get more of a focus, and that isn't the case. There's still as much focus on the G and the V ratings, but the outcome of inspection will also include a new C rating. And the process, of course, is different because the regulator will want assurance around compliance with those consumer gradings and use a few different techniques in order to get that assurance.
Okay, so the addition is the consumer element. So as part of the inspection, what is the regulator expecting to see? What reassurances will they be wanting?
I mean, essentially, the regulator's focus is on assurance at a governance level in relation to service outcomes. And what that means is it's not the detail of an organisation's kind of self-assessment against each of the new consumer standards, but it's really about what each registered provider has said it wants to achieve, and why that's appropriate, why that would demonstrate compliance to those consumer standards. So the whole approach is on outcomes. And that in itself is very much grounded in the regulator's co-regulatory approach. They're not going to tell organisations how to do this. So whilst the consumer standards do have a code of practice that gives some indication about what they want to see, they are expecting that boards have thought carefully about what they would see to be compliance. And therefore, the inspection will be looking at the assurance that a board can give that they are delivering on those areas.
Okay, so as part of preparing for the inspection process, is the question social housing providers should be asking, is our governance fit for purpose with the new standards?
I think there's definitely something about making sure that you have thought about those self-assessments, which each organisation will have made against all of the regulatory standards. But in those, really thinking about what they need to be seeing as a board in order to give them assurance that the direction of travel is right. I don't think there's an expectation that everybody's going to be perfect from day one. In fact, I think that's very unrealistic.
Well, I think the inspector said something at the beginning of the year. He didn't expect many C1s, I think he was saying, wasn't he?
Yeah, and I think that is realistic. I mean, I think if you look at the detail of the standards, I don't really know how any organisation can ever really say it is fully compliant and therefore the regulator can't, because it's a people business. Life changes. What is right one day might not be the day afterwards. But I do think it is about ensuring that the board's oversight, its corporate plan, at the highest level, its objectives are looking at the right things. So if you have areas of day-to-day service delivery, which are commonly showing a sort of red or amber in your regulated performance, but they're not showing in your corporate plan, then I'm not sure the regulator's going to be persuaded that you're looking at the right things. So I think getting the basics right is really important. I also think about how boards have allocated their resources to focus on what the priorities are is something that probably needs a bit of rethinking in the current climate. And then have you got the right people sitting around the table to govern those areas? Making sure that you've got the right expertise and knowledge. And that's not about boards being absolutely packed to the gills full of housing people, so to speak. I think it's about curiosity, scrutiny, asking the right questions. So everything does come back to governance in the end, but I think making sure that your reporting structures, the way that reports are written, what you're seeing at board level is going to give you the right grip on delivery against the standards is important.
So I think you might have answered some of this for this next question. Are social housing providers ready for inspection? And I suppose what I mean by that, do they understand what is required of them? And if not, what action should they be taking?
Generally, I think they should be, not the processes in and of itself, but certainly consumer standards have been well trailed. And this might sound a bit harsh, but I don't think there's really any excuse for there not being quite a bit of work already undertaken prior to April. But I do think that robust, holistic view of where you are as an organisation against the self-assessments needs to be sort of fully owned at board level. I'm not sure everybody's quite there yet with that, because I think some of the self-assessments have taken a little bit longer for some organisations, quite rightly, because there's a lot of detail in there. But I also think the bit that's involved in that is about ensuring that the customer voice is heard in those self-assessments. If you're going to start off on the right footing, really get ready for inspection, then what have customers told you against all of those consumer standards, not just the one that's specifically focused on transparency and accountability, on engagement with customers. But that said, don't forget about the governance and financial viability standards either, because they are, as I said, equally important in this process. So I think there is a real focusing on the consumer side, absolutely quite rightly, but that can't be to the detriment of the other areas of the business, because what's the point in being brilliant at delivering if you are not viable as an organisation or you're not great at governing it?
Okay, that's a pretty clear answer there, I think, Angela. So from what you said, it would seem the regulator wants long-term changes with this new regulatory regime. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, I do. And I don't think this is an overnight fix at all. And I think anybody who thinks that this is a tick box exercise, or anybody who has been in the housing sector long enough to remember the old audit commission, key lines of inquiry approach, this is not that. This is not about you can do things just to get through the inspection process. I think what we're talking about here is real embedded delivery with purpose. So I think register providers need to seek to get customer input, as I've said, but they need to listen to it. They need to respond to it. They need to seek feedback on whether they've actually delivered in the right way. That's not always about saying yes to customers. Actually, it's about having an open, adult, engaged conversation about what they can and cannot do. And I think it's also about being very clear as a board about what you would see as outcomes or evidence against delivery. All of those things take a while to achieve. There are some big topics in the consumer standards. Data, I think anybody who works in housing is probably fed up of hearing about data integrity, data accuracy, but how you use data and how you gather data, that's not a small short-term project at all. It's an ongoing, lengthy exercise. I think understanding that, how it applies across your business. So yeah, all of this is medium to long-term stuff, really. So although I think the Q1 inspection outcomes will be really interesting, there'll be a lot of learning from that process. There's more to come, I think, as this sort of beds in across the next year.
So really, I think the message there, do not underestimate the scale of what you're dealing with.
Yeah, I think so. But also do what is right for your organisation. Have confidence in what you know already, which might be about those things that you know you do well, that you've validated that you do well, but also those things where you might need to strengthen some areas or even fill some gaps, and be realistic about planning for those things. Understanding that, setting realistic goals, milestones along the pathway to get there is really important. Although I think there's going to be a real industry, we're probably part of that, I think, in terms of learning from inspection, talking about what works well and what doesn't work well. But I would always encourage providers to be very aware of their organisation, their tenants' needs, their geography, and what will be the right response from them.
Okay, so just before we go, do you have any parting thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, I suppose building on that, realistic, clear timeframes for everything that you do. And I think boards need to be on top of this. So having those milestones, I can't really emphasize that enough. It's fine to have a sort of end point goal, but how do you know you're getting there, and what that looks like at the end of it is really important. I think understanding what your priorities are, it's very hard at the moment. There's a lot to do. Being really sort of clear-sighted about what are priorities for your organisation, and confident about those things that you can probably put a bit lower down the list because it's not right for your organisation at this point. Everything feels like everything is equally important at the moment. So prioritising, taking some time to think about that. And then making sure that if you are going to do something, that you are kind of comprehensive and rounded about it. You know what resource it's going to take. You've got the capacity to deliver it. You know what it's going to do in terms of performance and service outcomes. You've thought about what it means to colleagues and to customers, and you've built all of that into the process.
Thank you, Angela, for sharing your expertise with us. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today. If you're keen to learn more about social housing, make sure to check out our social media channels. Thank you.